Okay, we're going to learn about some input and output. Basically, I want to show you very quickly how Python does this. It's not hard, and there's one trick that you'll have to know in order to get started. We're going to load up Python, or idle, I should say, and then make a new document, and mine's ready to go. So if I need anything up here, I'll write some notes for you to look at, and I'll explain some things as I go down here. The basic thing is very easy, which is just like if I was to take a variable and I was to say, here's my name, and then I was to say, okay, I want to print that name. Instead of saying name equals a particular thing, we can have the user tell us their name by putting the word input there. And input looks a lot like print. This is the input, this is the output, except that we put it on the right hand side of the equal sign always, because we are assigning it into a variable. And just like print, we can put behind it some information, which is what will appear on the screen when we run it. So just a couple things I would like to point out. Input must be assigned to a variable. So that means that input, I can't type, must be on the right side of the equal sign. Okay, so let's just quick run this so you can see what it looks like. Input test. Okay, so input comes with the thing that goes in the parentheses is actually output, right? It's actually showing up on the screen, but then it pauses and it waits for us to type something. And it will not continue until we've pressed the enter return key. So I do that, and then the program continues, and of course what it continues doing for me is just printing that name, and that information comes from this input statement. Now, that's very straightforward, and then output, there's really nothing new to say about output. You can mix the variables and text just like we did in the last one. Just remember that the difference between a variable where I set the information and an input is where the user sets the information. And that's where, programs get interesting, because you don't always want to tell it what you're doing. So now you could give somebody else this program, they'll put in their name, and then it will do something. So that's what makes input so interesting. Now, if you remembered the previous assignments, we talked about data types. And so the only trick about input is that you still have to be thinking about what kind of data do you want the person to input when they are running their program. So when I make this one and I'm doing a name, I could print and say, okay, well, what was the type of data that came into this? And so I run it, and I put in a name, and it tells me that that was a string, which it is, right? Text. So that sounds great. I'm going to put in this. Must consider the data type. And this is why I do that. Because now I'm going to do, I want a number. Because maybe I want to do math. And I want to add two numbers together. So I want to make a number, and I want to make another number. I was just thinking of something else, but I'll save that till after I describe this. So I want to print what type is my number. Now maybe I'll get to add this in a minute, but first let me just run this and show you what happens. Notice we didn't do anything different. So how does the computer know if we're putting in a number or if we're putting in a string? My name is Nancy. Nancy is the name of the user. It's a string. So now I'm going to put in the number 8. And I'm going to put in the number 4. And it tells me that that was a string. So here's where the problem is. What input does is input just takes whatever the user puts and then assumes that it's a string, that it's just text that the user puts in. So how is this going to work if I want to print those two numbers added together? How do I say number plus number 2 if those numbers are actually strings and not integers? So just one more second and we'll see. We're going to enter 8. We're going to enter 4. It tells us it's a string, and it tells us the answer is 84. So do you see what it's doing there? It's just combining the two. It's saying, oh, you want to add those? This is how it adds strings. It just takes the first string and it adds it to the second string, and it doesn't know how to do math because those are strings. So what we really want to do is we need to convert these numbers somehow into integers. The good news is that there's a function that can do that for us. So what we can do is after we input, we can say, okay, I want number to equal something else. And what we can do is we can say int number. And what this says is it says convert the old number into an integer and then store that back in number again. So now it's an integer. And we can do the same thing with number 2. We do int. So the fancy word for this is called casting a variable into a new variable type. We're basically converting the variable. So I'm going to write these things down in my notes up here. Input always is a string. You must cast the variable into the type you desire. So now we're casting them into integers, and that's going to be what we normally do, is cast into integers. So when I run this, okay, this is getting silly, but I'll do 8 and 4 again. This time, my type of my number is an integer because I converted it. And now the answer is 12, which is what I expected. So that's how we get math to work. Now this is annoying because every time you do an input, then you have to write another line which converts it. And there's actually a shortcut that we can use. So instead of making a new line, what we're going to do is we're going to put it in the same line of code. So the way that this works is, the inside parentheses go first. So the first inside parentheses is actually the enter a number that gets output to the screen. Excuse me. Just a yawn, sorry. I always bore myself when I'm on these videos. So it inputs, and then after it gets the input from this, it converts it into an integer, and then it puts it into number. So we can do that here as well. Now remember, I said you could cast it into any type that you desire, so there's other things that you could cast it in as well. Before I do that, I want to show you 2 other tricks. And that is, number 1, we're getting sick of this, what is your name, right? We're not really using this right now. do I want to delete it? So if I could just take it out, and now of course it's not going to run anymore. But what if you wanted to not use some code, but maybe come back to it later? You can go up to this format button and you can say comment out region. It's also the, I believe, control 3. And what it does is it puts this in here. So now they're comments and they're still here, but the computer will ignore them. So now when I run this, it'll just come right back down to here. So that's one thing. The second thing to consider is this text right here, enter a number. This is where you get into a little bit of user interface, is what kinds of things do you want to do when you tell the person what to what to do. This is what, if we are going to give this to somebody, they would see this and they would have to interpret it and give us the results that we want. So you never want to just be like, question mark. You got to tell them something. And so it's up to you. You can be like, please provide a numerical value. Or you can ask a question. What is a number? Or you could just kind of be like number and maybe a colon after it. Or sometimes I like to put like a little arrow, like here's where you put your number. So you can kind of have some fun with that and decide how you want to do this. What I'm doing right now is probably not very good user interface, because how would they know exactly what that means? Okay, so I'm going to run this just one more time to show you that we can skip right to number. It skipped over the part that we commented, and I can put in a number. But I want to add a decimal to this. I want to add 6.5, and oh no, now it's all messed up. So what just happened there? Invalid literal for int. So what happened was I put in 6.5, but it was expecting an integer, and so I got crabby. I actually didn't expect that to give an error. I thought it would just ignore the 0.5. But if you think that you're going to have a decimal, you better cast it into the right kind of information. Now, I have no problem because I can do that. And you'll notice also that the answer would then be a decimal, and so the answer is also a float type. One more, I suppose, I've never actually done this before, but you could say, you know what, I expect them to enter a Boolean, and maybe I'll ask them if they're telling the truth or not. And I have no idea what that's going to do when I try to add it together, so we got to find out. But if I'm doing this, I'd better do something like that. Make sure you capitalize it, because that's how the computer understands truth or false. So false plus 3.4. Interesting. Not sure why that happened, but you'll do notice that it made it into a Boolean, and then somehow it managed to make it into 4.4. I don't know why that wasn't an error, but sure, go for it. Anyway, that doesn't come up very often, but I wanted to show you that you can cast these things as anything you want. All right, so now you understand how input works. You understand the importance of thinking about data types as you ask for input, and you understand, well, hopefully everything. Little hints here and there to help you along. So have some fun with this one, and the assignments will start getting more interesting with the more things that we can do, of course.